The Cultural Revolution in the People's Republic of China was like a fire that had been deliberately lit inside someone's own home, in the belief that the house would somehow be stronger for having survived it. Burn away the furniture, burn away the rot, burn away the habits and assumptions that had crept in over time, and what remained could be rebuilt cleaner, more pure. The revolution would continue rejuvenated. By the mid to late 1960s, that fire had spread far beyond what anyone could control. It had reached the foundations. Putting it out required extreme measures, and those measures left the structure even weaker than before. More than 1 million people had been killed as a result. When I asked Professor Matt Galway, an expert on Maoism amongst other things, if he could sum up the Cultural Revolution in a single word, he didn't hesitate. He said it was chaos. Mao's theory of continual revolution, of keeping society in a permanent state of ideological struggle to prevent it from sliding back into bourgeois habits, collided with very real political needs. He used his personality cult to unleash the Red Guards, encouraging young radicals to destroy the Four Olds, while at the same time clearing away rivals who had grown powerful during the years when Mao himself had stepped back after the catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward. We spent hours on this in Season 2, so I won't retrace every step, but the result by the end of the decade was clear enough. The attempt to burn out the bad tendencies and reinvigorate the revolution had, well, the house was seriously burnt. The fire had been put out. The Red Guard were gone after the military was put back together to literally fight them in the streets in some cities, but the country was exhausted, paranoid and less stable than it was previously, before this cleansing fire had been started. Mao had maintained power, but the country was smouldering, and the physical foundations of Mao himself were getting weaker with age as well. Back in 1966, at the ripe age of 72, he had launched the Cultural Revolution with theatrical gestures meant to demonstrate vitality, including a highly publicized swim in the Yangtze River. 5 years later, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, the change in him was visible. He was aging, he was more withdrawn, more sensitive, and increasingly aware that time was no longer on his side. Succession was unavoidable, even though the subject had always been a little bit of a thorny issue. On a number of occasions over the previous decade, loyalty itself had become a volatile thing in the People's Republic. Men who seemed indispensable one year could be denounced the next. Several figures who had once appeared to be natural heirs had they themselves been destroyed. That pattern did not inspire confidence inside the party or in Mao himself. But a successor still had to be named, and Mao needed someone who embodied absolute loyalty. By the end of the 1960s, that figure was Lin Biao. Lin Biao was defense minister, the architect of Mao's personality cult, also within the military, and by 1969, he had been formally written into the constitution as Mao's successor. On paper, the future looked settled. In reality, it would follow a familiar path. Lin Biao had risen in prominence over the last decade, having replaced the former Minister of National Defense, Peng Duhai, after Peng's fatal mistake at a party conference in the city of Lushan back in 1959, when he criticized the Great Leap Forward after seeing the results of it firsthand. Some accounts suggest that Lin privately agreed with Peng, but publicly he sided with Mao, and that decision carried him a long way. As defense minister, Lin oversaw the deep fusion of the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, with the Communist Party, injecting Mao Zedong thought into military life and encouraging officers to see themselves as political as well as military actors. Mao liked what he saw, and Lin rose steadily. In 1965, Lin Biao's name was attached to "Long live the People's War," a text urging the revolutionary movements of the global south to encircle the capitalist cities, the capitalist world, through prolonged popular struggle, without reliance on professional armies or external patrons. The idea resonated widely. Around the same time, Lin Biao was deeply involved in compiling the quotations of Mao that became the Little Red Book, helping to turn the leader's words into portable scripture and setting the stage for the Cultural Revolution itself. As senior figures fell, Lin kept rising. Liu Shaoqi was destroyed in the Cultural Revolution. Zhou Enlai survived by sheer political dexterity, as he had and would continue to. Lin Biao found himself moving upward almost by default. What's interesting, though, is that for all his reputation as Mao's most devoted disciple, Lin Biao was never comfortable with power. He had seen very clearly what happened to people who rose too high, too quickly, or too confidently. And during the Cultural Revolution, that lesson was being reinforced daily. Lin survived by playing the game in a very particular way, and his methods, from a certain angle, could be seen as almost comical, if there weren't such life and death consequences at risk. During the most chaotic years of the Cultural Revolution, when ideology was fluid, accusations were arbitrary, and yesterday's loyalty could become today's crime, Lin Biao decided that the safest course of action was to say as little as possible. He avoided party meetings unless directly summoned. When he was forced to attend, he answered questions vaguely, committed himself to nothing, and offered no initiative of his own. He developed what became known as his 3 no's: no responsibility, no suggestions, and no crime. He largely withdrew from daily administration, secluding himself in his office, receiving briefings for half an hour in the morning and another half hour in the afternoon, and otherwise remaining out of sight. Over time, this withdrawal kind of took on an air of profundity. His silence was mistaken for strategy, and his absence was read as restraint. The person that doesn't open their mouth can't put their foot in it. Lin Biao acquired a reputation as a deep, mysterious operator, when in reality, he was doing everything possible not to say something that would be interpreted poorly during this reign of chaos. And that's where the comparison for me becomes unavoidable. Lin Biao was, in many ways, echoing the character of George Costanza in a Maoist revolutionary state. He didn't want responsibility. Every promotion was initially refused, then reluctantly accepted when refusal was no longer possible. He allowed his name to be attached to documents he hadn't written, provided they praised Mao. He avoided taking positions on anything contentious. He didn't particularly believe in the Cultural Revolution as it unfolded, but he'd been instrumental in setting it in motion, and he knew how dangerous it was to step out of line once it was underway. He mastered the visual language of loyalty. He made sure to arrive before Mao, to greet him publicly, to stand close in photographs, always with the little red book visible in his hand. On every issue that mattered, Lin's method was simple. If Mao had spoken, agree with that completely. If he hadn't made his ideas clear yet, say nothing at all and wait. Go back to sleep under the desk, as it were, but make sure the photo of you and him looked really good. All of this mattered because the Cultural Revolution had torn through the military just as it had through the party and just about everything else. In fact, more than 80,000 officers had been purged. Over 1,000 of those had been killed through torture, starvation in prison, or execution. And when Mao finally decided that the fire he had started was threatening to bring the whole structure down, it was the army that was called in and used to restore order. Now, the consequence of that was that the army, already having been thoroughly doused in Mao Zedong thought and politicized by Lin Biao, was now in the position to increase its membership in the party itself, especially as so many civilian members had been purged during the Cultural Revolution. This left Lin Biao, as defense minister, sitting at the center of a new power base in the Communist Party. Now, he hadn't planned it this way, he hadn't reached out for it, but by surviving chaos better than most, he again found himself elevated by default. By 1969, when Lin Biao was written into the constitution as Mao's successor, he had the favor of the chairman and the backing of key military networks. On the surface, the succession problem appeared solved. Underneath, all the old dangers were still there for Lin Biao. 2 years later, he was dead. In a plane crash, under circumstances so strange that they still aren't really explained. It began just like it had for Peng Duhai, at a party conference in Lushan in 1970. This time, instead of criticizing Mao, Lin and his allies had been pushing in the opposite direction. They had sought to enshrine Mao Zedong thought and Mao himself more deeply into the state constitution, describing Mao's development of Marxism-Leninism as creative and comprehensive, even using the word genius. Now, for someone like Lin Biao, this, feels safe. For the better part of a decade, he's built his career on over-fulfilling on loyalty points. But Mao was not a predictable reader of flattery. Genius, to him, implied some kind of ideological finality, a sense that the revolution had reached its endpoint in this person's view, as if he was being told to retire, that his work was complete. It also raised the spectre Mao feared most, being elevated into a symbolic position while real power passed quietly to his successor. That fear had driven the Cultural Revolution in the first place. Mao had already been sidelined once, after the Great Leap Forward. Any hint of that happening again was intolerable. Also, by this point, the tool of Mao's cult of personality, to him, had achieved its use. The Cultural Revolution was over. He won. To keep adding layers of glaze was redundant. Yet Lin Biao was trying to do exactly that. Why? Suddenly, the power base that Lin Biao had managed to develop across the military looks suspicious in Mao's eyes. Now, what made this moment a little different to what had happened in earlier purges is that Mao hesitated. According to Philip Short in his biography of Mao, he stays his hand. He shielded Lin Biao at first, hoping he would step back, offer a self-criticism, demonstrate that he understood the limits of his position. He wasn't getting too tall, and he knew who was boss. Mostly because Mao had no appetite for destroying another chosen heir. Another failure wouldn't just be destabilizing, it would actually begin to reflect poorly on Mao's judgment. You can only play that guy was actually a traitor, a revisionist, a betrayal card so many times before it makes you look bad that you keep picking these so-called traitors. So he does offer Lin Biao these off-ramps, but he never takes the exit. The silence, the refusal to perform, the expected abasement is what slowly turns suspicion into certainty for Mao. He begins removing his defense minister's people carefully and without spectacle. Panels bearing Lin's calligraphy are taken down from public buildings. Senior officers associated with him are summoned, criticized, and instructed to write their own self-criticisms. Lin himself withdraws to the coastal area of Beidaihe, stops working, grows increasingly erratic and depressed. From Mao's perspective, Lin Biao's behavior doesn't look like confusion anymore or just ill health. It looks like he is evading him. By the summer of 1971, Mao decided that the matter could no longer be left just to drift. He begins touring the country, meeting senior political and military figures, warning them that a serious line struggle has taken place, that a certain individual had been too eager to become head of state, to split the party, to seize power. Word of these meetings travels slowly, and when it finally reaches Lin Biao, he still does nothing. There is no self-criticism, no reassurance, and no attempt to re-establish trust. At that point, events begin to move beyond Mao's control. While he is maneuvering politically, events inside Lin Biao's own household begin to move faster than anyone intends. His wife, Ye Kun, and his son, Lin Lijiu, panic. They believe the purge is imminent. They've watched this pattern play out too many times to imagine a benign outcome. Waiting feels more dangerous than acting. What follows is confused and frantic. Lin Lijiu and a small circle of young Air Force officers talk among themselves, sketching scenarios, imagining resistance, grasping for options. Their conversations veer into fantasy and bravado, including crude, impractical notions of attacking Mao, none of which advance beyond talk. No real preparations are made, no coherent plans. This is, some amateurs spitballing. Throughout all of this, it remains unclear how much Lin Biao himself understands or authorizes any of it. He is physically unwell, heavily medicated, withdrawn, and, by all accounts, silent. But with him not really interacting or making his opinions apparently known, it's the family's fear that is taking the initiative, and it drives what happens next. Late on the night of September 12th, 1971, an unauthorized Trident aircraft is waiting at an airfield. Just after midnight, Lin Biao, his wife, his son, and a small group of aides are driven to it. On the way, Lin's chief bodyguard leaps from the moving car and is shot and wounded. The aircraft takes off with its navigation lights turned off, flying low, attempting to avoid radar as it heads north toward Mongolia. When Mao was informed of what's happening, his response was subdued and fatalistic. Asked whether the plane should be shot down, he refuses. "The skies will rain, widows will remarry," he says. "These things are unstoppable. Let them go." A few hours later, the aircraft crashes in the Mongolian steppe near Indochina. All on board are killed. The evidence suggests a failed emergency landing. Flying at low altitude, the plane likely ran out of fuel, but there's no real nailed-on version of this, and there's no real closure to this event, although the party will create a narrative to suit them. As I said, it's not exactly clear what happened or why, although the official party version was that this was a coup gone wrong and Lin Biao had been attempting to flee to the Soviet Union. This doomed flight had denied the ending that Mao previously had always controlled in prior purges of these kinds of cadre. Lin Biao didn't abase himself, instead he ran away and died. Mao retreated, physically ill, and fell into a deep depression. When he re-emerged, he looked diminished. Lin Biao had not just been another fallen comrade, he had been the future Mao himself had authorized. And when that future vanished into the darkness, well, it looked bleak for him. And there is a lot of uncertainty in regards to their comrades to the west. After the 1969 border clashes, China was facing the possibility of a real war with the Soviet Union, while its own political system was still reeling from internal purges and this insane plane crash. But some within his party had suggested a bold way to turn the tables in this battle for communist hegemony. A course that had not been favoured by Lin Biao when he was still of influence, and one that is coming from the old political hand of Zhou Enlai. Within months, Mao is looking outward toward diplomacy, toward balance of power, to restore China back to some stable position, toward the seemingly unthinkable prospect of an American president arriving in Beijing. There had actually been subtle winks, nods, and gazes between the two unlikely partners on the international stage, which had been exchanged for months over the course of 1971. And while we sometimes imagine that the people operating at this level are cool, composed, hyper-competent professionals, well, in this case it was closer to two kind of awkward teenagers trying to work out whether the other one liked them, terrified of making the first move, and constantly misreading the signals. Washington had been talking quietly about the need to rethink China even before Nixon had come to office. But he himself had written about the danger of leaving China isolated and embittered, of letting it harden into permanent hostility. But talk was one thing, acting on it was another. There were no formal relations between the two, no trusted channels, no shared language for how this was even supposed to work. So everything happened indirectly, through third parties, hints, gestures that could always be denied if they landed badly. Travel restrictions were eased. A couple of American sailors who had wandered into Chinese waters were released. Statements were made about opening channels of communication, while messages were passed through Pakistan and Romania like notes folded under a desk. But even then, nobody seemed quite sure who was authorized to say what. At one point, the American ambassador in Warsaw approached his Chinese counterpart at a diplomatic reception to suggest talks. The Chinese official panicked, backed away, and literally fled down a staircase because this encounter was happening, but he hadn't been given any instructions for that kind of conversation, and he wasn't going to just wing it. So he ran away. This is pretty funny when we're talking about countries. It wasn't all farce, however. In one instance, an American businessman who had been imprisoned for years in China as a spy, well, unfortunately, he took his own life without knowing he was soon to be released as a gesture of goodwill. Another dark moment came when Nixon's invasion of Cambodia in 1970 produced a kind of freeze on the fragile feelers between Washington and Beijing. But the resumption of slightly awkward advances did resume, and some landed while others still went unrecognized. On China's National Day in 1970, Zhou Enlai arranged for someone named Edgar Snow, an American journalist who had once been Mao's chosen interpreter to the West, and he gets them to stand beside Mao on Tiananmen Square and be photographed. No foreigner had ever been given that honor. It was meant as a message. This opening has Mao's personal backing. The Americans missed this. Later that year, Mao went even further. In an interview with Edgar Snow, he openly referenced Nixon's earlier remark that he wanted to visit China before he died, and he said he would be happy to speak with him, either as a tourist or as president. Snow was given the official transcript and asked to delay publication. Mao assumed, reasonably, that the message would be passed on, but it wasn't. At that point, Mao did something uncharacteristically direct. In March 1971, a Chinese table tennis team travelled to the World Championships in Japan, the first Chinese athletes to go abroad in years. During the tournament, a teenage American player casually mentioned to a Chinese teammate that he'd love to visit Beijing. The comment was reported up the chain. Zhou Enlai raised it with Mao, and they initially dismissed it. But then, that night, after taking his sleeping pills, Mao changed his mind. He called his nurse and told her to ring the foreign ministry with instructions to invite the Americans immediately. What ended up being called ping-pong diplomacy took the world by surprise. One of those curveballs from outside of the political world that could cut through the paralysis. The American team arrived in China to an almost theatrical welcome. Zhou Enlai received them personally and declared that they had opened a new chapter in relations between the two countries. It would later be treated as such a strange hinge point in American history that Forrest Gump would find himself improbably folded into it in his adventures through life. 3 months later, under the pretense of having a nasty stomach virus in Pakistan, Henry Kissinger, sly as ever, secretly flew to Beijing, and the embrace was finally achieved. Now, we'll get back to China, Nixon, and what that means for both and everyone else in a moment, but it's worth tying events here to another secret activity that Kissinger had been working on. Since 1969, when Nixon first took office, his administration had proposed secret peace talks with North Vietnam that were taking place in parallel with four-party negotiations that had been publicly announced in Paris the previous year under Johnson. Those negotiations, the official ones, were being held between the US, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the insurgent NLF. Now, as it turned out, the Soviets had been pressuring the North Vietnamese to join these initial peace talks back then. They were getting to the point where they wanted a negotiated settlement. They're footing a very large bill for their support in this war. And it's worth remembering because, we usually talk about Vietnam as this proxy war, and it was for sure, but it was first and foremost a civil war. It just so happened to have investors. Investors that, for all of their grand rhetoric, are usually interested in their bottom line. And this was on both sides of the Cold War. But these official peace talks end up kind of going nowhere. But interestingly, we can see the effects of the Sino-Soviet split at play at these official talks. I've got a primary document here in the Edward Miller collection, and it details the Chinese Foreign Minister Chen Yi, and he's speaking with Lê Đức Thọ about how they would have preferred the Vietnamese to hold out for a better position militarily before agreeing to start these peace talks, which shows, who was more influential for the Vietnamese communists, and again, how China and the Soviets were not this unified monolith of communism. One part of the conversations they were having back at the end of 1968 is fascinating because the Chinese minister is saying, look, we don't think what you've done here is smart. And look, we're going to have more advice for what you should do in the next couple of months, so why don't you just be patient? And Lê Đức Thọ is like, you know what? You gave us some pretty bad advice back at the Geneva Accords in 1954, and now we're kind of stuck in this mess. And we've actually gained a little bit of experience ourselves in the last 15 years or so. So, tell you what, how about we'll decide what we're going to do this time, okay? It kind of has that kind of, I'm not changing too much there. And it's another echo of the Chinese big brother dynamic to Vietnam, as is the Vietnam to Cambodia dynamic we've seen constantly between the Khmer Rouge and Hanoi. We see in their respective annoyance this, not liking being told what to do by their bigger neighbour. In any case, soon the North Vietnamese accept the offer from Nixon to go behind the official peace talks. Lê Đức Thọ, who had told the Chinese to mind their own business for the moment, was the principal negotiator in this safe house in Paris with Kissinger, these secret peace talks. Now, you'll recall that the first Nixon administration had come to power on a promise of ending the war quickly. Secret bombing of Cambodia had been part of that, and these secret peace talks were supposed to be, another tool in that tool belt. The Nixon administration was a little bit like that, and they had their reasons, and in the case of the secret peace talks, you can see how it kind of makes sense. The idea is that it, without all of the public pride and, all of the proper procedure and bluster that goes on with official peace talks, this version could be done more efficiently, getting down to brass tacks, as it were. Because I think I'm right in remembering this, but in the original Geneva peace talks, I think it had taken weeks just to figure out a seating arrangement that all the parties could agree upon because of how the seats would have somehow conveyed some kind of advantage or diminished some parties' prominence. The idea is that these secret talks can just cut through all of that kind of nonsense. And it also means that perhaps you can speak a bit more frankly. The records of these talks do reflect more openness and honesty about the reality of what's going on, as well as politics generally. This is what each side really wanted, although they didn't produce a peace as quickly as Nixon and Kissinger had assumed they might. The North Vietnamese were not pushovers. After 2 years, so in the middle of 1971, one particular issue had become a deadlock that the North would not back down from. They insisted that the South Vietnamese president, Nguyen Van Thieu, had to be removed from office as a condition of peace. And this issue provided a platform for a discussion in one of these meetings where the communists just laid out what they knew the US plans to really be, kind of dressing down your opponent by being like, look, I know what you're trying to do. Le Duc Tho stated that the Americans had gone too deeply into this war, they had suffered repeated failures, and now faced the serious difficulty of finding a way out. He knew they wanted to disengage, but he also knew that they were trying to do so while maintaining the greatest advantage possible. He knew that their policy of Vietnamization was meant to preserve the South Vietnamese administration and keep the status quo even after the American troops were gone. He questioned Kissinger, saying, "You came here wanting speedy negotiations, but all you were focusing on is things like prisoners of war releases, not the administration in the South, and when all of the US troops will be gone. These are concrete deadlines we want." In his view, the Americans were just complicating things. There was no miracle solution that they were going to be able to find. Now, Kissinger hears all this, and he's like, well, okay, that's a pretty astute reading. But he's able to counter and say, well, we know that those exact same outcomes you're pressing for are exactly what you would hope for to win your war. If we withdraw all of our troops and allow for the South Vietnamese administration to be dissolved or overrun militarily, then it's obvious that this would just be the same as letting you win. For the Americans, they wanted all of the North Vietnamese troops out of South Vietnam as a precondition for peace. And for the North Vietnamese, their primary goal was getting a different administration in the South. Or, it should be said, that these are like the starting positions in a sales negotiation. That's like the initial price that people are going into here with, but they have a real price that they're willing to get down to and real aims that they're willing to settle on. And both kind of know what the other one is planning to do as well. They kind of know what the other person's bottom line is. But the secret talks allow for things to come up that usually wouldn't in the official ones. This is like when you get to talk to the person at the call center without the call being recorded. They're a little bit more giving you the real picture. The North Vietnamese say, look, even in the States and in world opinion, everyone is going to look favorably on you if you got rid of Nguyen Van Thieu. You know it, we know it. The regime is rotten. Why don't you just get rid of it? And since we're here talking, maybe you could just agree to that in secret? Then Washington can still act like it wants to keep him, isn't abandoning him, and, we can make progress. And Kissinger says, look, we're not going to secretly agree to overthrow the leader of an allied country. That's crazy. Which is a little bit rich from the US on that front, but it's not like you can completely shed all of your pretenses, even in the secret peace talks. You have to keep some of the mask on. This deadlock issue would remain for a while, but Kissinger does make a good point at the end of these meetings where he says, look, we would assume that a future South Vietnamese government would pursue a neutral foreign policy. We are also going to agree to a huge economic aid program once we're gone, almost $8 billion. With around $3 billion going to North Vietnam. He also says that unlike in 1954, when Eisenhower and the US had not actually signed the agreement in Geneva, well, the Nixon administration is completely different. They don't want to continue to see Vietnam as if it's the most key strategic position in the world anymore. They didn't want to make new military bases like they had before. It was a different time. Le Duc Tho had also been able to bring up Kissinger's trip to China as well and say, like, look, we can see you're going here and there, you're trying to do this behind even our backs, but you've still not made progress with us in bringing this peace to bear. So by the end of 1971, there was still no agreement, and each side had clearly understood the real intentions of the other. There were outside forces at play which would end up hastening things, but there are things that are going to keep happening on the ground as well. Because, like most peace negotiations during a war, a lot of the negotiation is actually happening on the battlefield still. As you'll recall, my dear listener, the map of the Indo-Chinese theatre had expanded as these attempts for peace had intensified. Cambodia became a vital part of this picture. At the beginning of 1972, Vietnamese communist battalions had been recalled from Cambodia following the end of the disastrous Chen La-Tu campaign. They were needed for a massive offensive that would seek to break the South Vietnamese state. A decisive, conventional military victory that would have strengthened the hand of the communist negotiators. More on that in a moment, but first, the other inescapable piece of the puzzle comes into play. Something we've been speaking about for a long time that continually reared its head when it came to Vietnam. The 4-year presidential cycle. Nixon was the incumbent president running on order, stability, and results. The election date was in November. His campaign put Vietnam front and center. He was going to be the one that got out of this disastrous war he had inherited. Peace with honor was again going to be a slogan, and projecting international strength through diplomacy was his method. When Nixon spoke with Kissinger in January 1972, you can listen in on the fragility of the South Vietnamese regime, the optics of new communist aggression, and the upcoming trip to China. These are all on the forefront of the president's planning.
But we can't do anything about it, Henry. I mean, as I always say, and if the South Vietnamese can't handle it now, they never will be able to.
Well, that's right, but that's where our move next week is going to help a lot, because if their answer to our peace offer is an offensive,
right,
that should certainly help us in public opinion here.
Yeah, that is why I think making it perhaps on that date,
on the whole, the best
18th is better than waiting, because we just don't know when they're going to start hitting. Otherwise, it might look like a reaction to an offensive.
Exactly. And I think basically the Russians are putting them up to it to overshadow we have an intelligence report today in which one of their people in Paris says they're going to do it in February so that they can overshadow your trip to Peking.
Well, it won't do that.
I don't think they've got that much power.
Yeah. It won't.
On the other hand, it's a double-edged sword for them, because if they do it at that time, you're overshadowing their offensive.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The New York Times, the day before Nixon got to China, had a headline, like a trip to the moon. And the actual article went on to say that literally, not only was it like a voyage to the moon, metaphorically, but until the preparations for this journey began, the moon had actually had more official US visitors and more time on American television than all of mainland China.
Good morning. It is 7:30 p.m. in Peking. President Nixon has been in the capital of the People's Republic of China for some 9 hours now. He has already met with Chairman Mao. The president went to Mao's home for a talk that the White House described as serious and frank. That's all we know about it. With me here in New York is Dr. Jim Thompson of Harvard University.
Frank, I think it's a very significant development. It underlines the deep seriousness with which the Chinese view this trip. It's unusual to see the chairman that early. It's unusual to see him for an hour. This is no pure ceremonial occasion. There is deep substance at work.
The social systems of China and the United States are fundamentally different. And there exist great differences between the Chinese government and the United States government. However, these differences should not hinder China and the United States from establishing normal state relations, we hope that through a frank exchange of views between our two sides to gain a clearer notion of our differences and make efforts to find common ground, a new start can be made in the relations between our two countries. In conclusion, I propose a toast to the health of President Nixon and Mrs. Nixon, to the health of our other American guests, to the health of all our friends and comrades present, and to the friendship between the Chinese and American people.
So, my dear listener, as you can kind of tell from that reporting, this was a really, really big deal. The trip lasted a week, but Nixon and Kissinger met with Mao on his first afternoon there, which by all accounts, this meeting had been inserted into the day's schedule at the last minute. There was nothing leaked about what was actually discussed. Philip Short, in his biography of Mao, goes into some detail about that afternoon. The idea is that Nixon is going to be predominantly dealing with Zhou Enlai. Mao was ill, bedridden, depressed, still recovering from the Lin Biao affair and from a physical collapse only weeks earlier. His lungs were infected. It had been so bad that he had choked on phlegm and lost consciousness. His body was swollen with fluid retention. A new suit and shoes had to be made because nothing fit properly anymore. In the days before Nixon's arrival, his staff had been helping him practice standing, sitting, walking around his room, building enough stamina to endure what was planned as just a brief meeting with the president at some point on the trip. But as Nixon's motorcade moved through the emptied streets of Beijing, Mao changed the script. He'd been sitting by the phone, receiving minute-by-minute updates of Nixon's motorcade from the airport, like an anxious host awaiting an important guest. And although he was not in the best health, he was still calling the shots. He sent word that he wanted to see the president immediately. They had assumed that they were only going to have this, courtesy call with the great leader, but they would end up speaking to him for more than an hour. Nixon and Kissinger were driven to Zhongnanhai, to Mao's study. There was no ceremony, no grand hall, just a room lined with manuscripts and books stacked on tables and floors. Kissinger later wrote that it looked more like the retreat of a scholar than the office of the most powerful man in Asia. Mao stood there, supported by an attendant, physically diminished, yet still radiating, something that both Americans found unsettling. Kissinger compared him to de Gaulle in terms of concentrated willpower. Nixon, less poetic, still grasped the magnitude, saying it was like an encounter with history itself. Mao took Nixon's hand in both of his and held it for almost a minute. That gesture alone was historic. One man presided over what Mao had always described as the citadel of imperialism, backed by the strongest military and economy on earth. The other ruled a revolutionary state of 800 million people whose official doctrine called for the overthrow of that system. And now, here they were. Short suggests that, although other heads of state from the West would follow Nixon's lead, this was an unrivaled moment in Mao's life. Quote, "The moment when the leader of the Western world came to the Forbidden City, bearing in tribute a shared concern about a common enemy." End quote. The conversation did not follow the normal exchange of platitudes. Mao surprised Nixon almost immediately by saying that he preferred dealing with right-wing leaders. They're more predictable. It was a backhanded compliment, but a deliberate one. Mao understood that Nixon had the political space to do what a liberal American president might not survive attempting. Nixon, in turn, steered the discussion toward what both men knew was the real subject, the Soviet Union. The ideological language fell away quickly. This was not a summit about capitalism versus communism. It was about Moscow. Mao spoke in his usual elliptical style, embedding his meaning in tangents and half-jokes. Kissinger later said it was like watching shadows move across a wall, thoughts expressed in a way that conveyed intent without pinning anything down. Mao even laughed at his own revolutionary rhetoric, referring to men like himself as big cannons who talked about uniting the world against imperialism. And then he and Zhou Enlai chuckled at the theatricality of it. There was a recognition in that laughter that something fundamental had shifted. For Mao, the calculation was brutally pragmatic. After those border clashes with the Soviets in 1969, the possibility of a real war with Moscow was no longer theoretical. The Cultural Revolution had hollowed out China's institutions. The Lin Biao affair had shaken the succession and exposed fragility at the core of the system. China could not afford isolation on two fronts. An opening to Washington created strategic depths, complicated Soviet planning. It gave Beijing leverage. It also came at a cost to pride and reputation. This was the coach who only played one way, finally relenting to a change in tactics. For decades, Mao had cast China as the epicenter of world revolution, the red beacon that movements across Asia, Africa, and Latin America could orient themselves toward. Aligning, even tacitly, with the United States meant shifting from revolutionary evangelism to balance of power politics. Survival over ideological export. Nixon understood his side of the ledger just as clearly. From Washington's perspective, the opening to China fractured the communist bloc, strengthened America's hand with Moscow, and signaled to Hanoi that the world was rearranging itself. It also allowed Nixon to present himself in an election year as the statesman who had redrawn the global map, the man who would go to China, the man who could talk to Mao. Politically, the man that would go to the moon. The formal outcome of the visit was the Shanghai Communique. It did not pretend that disagreements had vanished. In fact, it spelled out some of them. On Taiwan, the language was deliberately ambiguous. Washington did not challenge the Chinese position, while they did reaffirm their interest in a peaceful resolution. It was diplomatic choreography, leaving space for future maneuver. But the deeper outcome was symbolic. The photograph in the People's Daily the next day showed Mao and Nixon together. For the Chinese public, who had grown up on slogans about defeating imperialism, this was seismic. The message was not that capitalism had been embraced, it was that China was no longer isolated. The first among the Western powers had come to Beijing on terms that suggested equality. For Mao personally, it was vindication and retreat woven together. In 1949, when the state was declared, he had argued that China should complete its house cleaning before deciding which foreign powers to admit. For years, that sounded, like a fanciful proposition, because Western governments refused to recognize that state. Now, the American president had arrived in person. China had stood up. Yet it stood up in a world defined less by permanent revolution than by managing contradictions between superpowers. For Nixon, the visit was a strategic coup layered over electoral timing. For Mao, it was a cold adjustment to geopolitical reality after the chaos of his own making. The rest of the world took notice as international relations found itself in a new era. The political groundwork for this had also been laid in tandem with Kissinger's earlier visits as well, and it's worth looking at that because it's a pretty significant moment in international relations history. The People's Republic of China had finally been given representation at the UN. Since 1949, their seat, the seat of China, had been occupied by Chiang Kai-shek's regime in Taipei. The Republic of China relegated to Taiwan after losing the Civil War. They're holding mainland China's seat, including its permanent place on the Security Council and its veto power. You might recall that back at the Geneva Accords of 1954, the People's Republic of China had only gained access to these discussions for peace in Indochina after getting the equivalent of a +1 invitation from the Soviets. That was the kind of thing that happened when you didn't have a proper seat at the UN. This is kind of crazy to think about now, that the then country of more than 800 million people had no representation in the central forum of post-war international politics. And like many issues with the UN, it was something born out of the system that governed it. Throughout the 50s and 60s, Washington in particular had methodically kept Beijing out. Every year, motions were introduced into the General Assembly to recognize the People's Republic instead of Taiwan. But every year, the US would rally enough votes to defeat them or otherwise reclassify the question in a way that would not get the majority to pass. That began to change in the 60s as the makeup of the organization changed. Decolonization had seen newly independent states in Africa and Asia that were less likely to treat Chinese Taipei as the legitimate government of China. Many of them were dealing with Beijing directly. Likewise, with the Sino-Soviet split, it was less convincing to keep making this grand claim that China was simply part of a monolithic communist bloc. Amongst Kissinger's secret shuffles to Beijing in October 1971, another vote was cast, and the UN General Assembly voted 76 in favour and 35 against, recognising the representatives of the People's Republic getting China's seat at the UN. And just like that, Beijing gets the seat, gets the Security Council membership, and the veto power. This was a massive vindication for Mao, who had arrived at this point on his own terms. It also signalled a new world of power balance, realpolitik, and international relations manoeuvres. And, like much else that occurred during the Cold War, this new balance of power would have ramifications in Cambodia, particularly over the next couple of decades, as friends of China's will become unlikely friends of the United States. But that's a little further down the track. Generally, when people talk about the Vietnam War, 1968 is the big central dividing line, the Tet Offensive. After that, the story changes. It becomes the simple, straight line to the end. America decides to leave, South Vietnam is doomed. It's this slow motion withdrawal from that point. And there's truth to all that, but it does risk glossing over some of the most important parts of the story, like Cambodia, as we've gone over, or this pivotal year of 1972. That's the year the war exploded into the largest conventional battles of the entire conflict. Not the biggest ambushes, not the most dramatic political shock, but the biggest battles. Tanks, heavy artillery, surface-to-air missiles, division-sized formations colliding in open warfare, massive casualties on both sides, larger in many respects than Tet itself. 1972 is this militarily pivotal year. As we've seen, it's also geopolitically a really big deal as well. As we just saw in February, Nixon is in Beijing shaking hands with Mao. Later that year, he pulls off a similarly huge diplomatic move when he also visits Moscow and signs the SALT agreements, which limit the nuclear arms race. These are big changes on that stage. And there was also the Paris peace talks, which we've gone over. They have been languishing for years in, hostility and with those stalemates, but this was the year that everything accelerated there as well. And all of this happens while the largest ground battles of the war rage on in South Vietnam. In many ways, it is the climax of the Vietnam War, through the lens of that, American war in Vietnam. It is not the end of the Civil War, and it's not the focus of where we're going to go with Cambodia, but 1972 is the climax of the Vietnam War as commonly understood. The offensive that would produce those battles had been decided months earlier. Toward the end of 1971, Le Duan had made his choice. The North would launch a massive conventional assault to prove that Nixon's hollowing out of South Vietnam and propping up of this puppet regime in Saigon could not survive without American ground forces. This, in his mind, would deliver a decisive political blow. In his general history of the Vietnam War, Max Hastings describes Le Duan as implacable as ever. He dismissed objections from comrades who warned that American air power could still devastate this kind of operation. For Le Duan, this was a battle of wills. Expose the weakness of Saigon, strengthen Hanoi's hand in Paris, perhaps even topple the South Vietnamese regime militarily. It was, in many respects, a repeat of his 1968 Tet Offensive. That had been more of a surprise, a massive guerrilla insurgency with isolated instances of conventional warfare, but it had also primarily been undertaken by the Viet Cong, who were decimated in that offensive. But here, again, 4 years later, Le Duan was willing to go forward once more, primarily this time with conventional North Vietnamese armed forces. And he was indifferent to the cost that this was going to incur in either South Vietnamese civilian lives, military lives, or those of his own army, or, in fact, the repercussions that would come from the United States. Tens of thousands of his people could die in this offensive. And we should remember, this is a civil war. This was the Vietnamese fighting Vietnamese. And you can dispense of the picture in your mind from Vietnam War movies of US troops in the jungle or streets. The 1972 Spring Offensive, this was North Vietnam versus South. And just like the Americans are showing a callousness in their indifference to the mess they were leaving behind in Vietnam, or trying to leave behind, the reality was that they were leaving. They were trying to negotiate a peace. As we saw, they were even putting a lot of money on the table that would go back to the country, including the North, as long as they could get out on politically acceptable terms. But they're going. That much was clear. So there are some questions that could be asked of Le Duan in just the same way we ask them of Nixon and Kissinger, which is, why are you doing this now? Is this completely necessary? We often look back at the American leadership of the war, and we consider it to be, this casual brutality, extremely high body counts, indifferent to the suffering that they were causing. Now, that's in some cases true, and in some cases a generalization, but overall we recoil from the American leadership in this conflict. But it would be dishonest to pretend that Hanoi's leadership was somehow gentler. In this war, there was a symmetry of cruelty that's worth remembering. The massacres at Hue are an example of that, right? Now, the offensive in which those occurred back during the Tet Offensive, well, the scale of what is being planned in 1972, it can't be concealed like the Tet Offensive was, which was this surprise. This is, practically visible from space. This was conventional war. North Vietnam was amassing entire divisions, tanks, artillery, missiles. By the 20th of January, just days after that Nixon-Kissinger tape that we just listened to, MACV briefings were already stating there was no doubt that a major campaign was imminently coming. And here's the crucial bit, because this was the first time since 1965 that South Vietnam would have to do most of the fighting on the ground. Because the Vietnamization, as it was called, of the war had been underway for years. American troop levels had plummeted from over 500,000 down to tens of thousands, and only several thousand American combat troops actually remained. The rest were advisors, aircrew support, things like that. The test of the South Vietnamese was going to be pretty extreme. And this was something that Nixon was alluding to on those tapes. If they can't do it now, when are they going to be able to do it kind of thing. And this was the bottom line. This was the real price that Washington was willing to go down to. If South Vietnam eventually fell, well, perhaps that was inevitable. But it needed to fall at a sufficient interval, to use Nixon's words, after American withdrawal, after Vietnamization had been completed, after the United States had, gotten out of Dodge, and the election day was paramount. A collapse before 1972 would be catastrophic. That's not peace with honor, regardless of how pithy that ideal had ever been. That was just losing. But a collapse maybe a year or two later? Well, that could be worked with. That could be framed differently. America had done all it could, had left the war to be fought by the Vietnamese, had left them everything they needed to fight that war and protect themselves. And if they fell then, well, the South would have just collapsed on its own. Not the American problem anymore, and not a political problem for the Nixon White House, right? Meanwhile, the Chinese angle here is important, and that's why we spent time explaining their side of things at the start of this episode. The pivot to Washington showed that they were willing to make political sacrifices of their own to help their own problems, their national interest. They want out of isolation. They want to, have a seat at the UN. They wanted a relationship with the United States. They were not willing to cut off all military and financial aid to Hanoi, and they also didn't really have the power to negotiate a peace behind Hanoi's back. But they had tacitly signaled through this re-establishment of ties with Washington that their broader geopolitical interests now outweighed just what was going on in Vietnam. Nixon hadn't left Beijing, securing a peace deal behind North Vietnam's back. But he did return with something just as important for him. Confidence. Confidence that China wasn't going to intervene militarily anymore. Confidence that he now had greater freedom of action. Because for over a decade, actually perhaps going back to as far as the First Indochina War and the American military support of the French, American policymakers had been terrified of triggering a repeat of Korea. Push too far north, deploy troops here rather than just down here, make one clumsy move in the wrong way, and they might risk a total escalation of the war that meant Chinese troops would pour across the border. That was, more or less, the start of World War III and a high potential for nuclear war. That was what you had to avoid. That was the trapdoor. But now, well, Nixon's looking at the map and thinking, all right, China's not coming in. And that changes everything. Now, at the same time, he knows, because Kissinger's having these secret negotiations with Le Duc Tho, that the North Vietnamese understand America is leaving. Which makes what happens next even more interesting. You could almost hear the personal irritation in Nixon's voice, as though Hanoi, by launching this offensive, was trying to ruin his diplomatic triumph, trying to damage his election prospects, as if they were crashing his party in Beijing. But from Hanoi's perspective, they had their own resentments that they were working through. We saw, back in 1969, how Le Duc Tho bristled at Chinese Big Brother interference. Now, watching Mao host Nixon, they saw something uncomfortably reminiscent of 1954. Another great power cutting deals above their heads. Another moment where Vietnamese blood might be subordinated to Chinese or American interests. That their war might have a delayed end once again. The North was still receiving aid from China, plenty of it, but now it's kind of transactional. It's coming almost apologetically because of this new relationship between the US and China. So that may be one factor that's reinforcing the determination of someone like Le Duan to assert their agency on the battlefield, to show that Hanoi, not Beijing, not Washington, was going to determine the outcome. Unfortunately, though, they're up against Nixon. The same Nixon who had floated the madman theory when he came to office, this idea that he could convince adversaries he was irrational enough to do anything, so you better kind of do what he said. And while that may have been strategic theatre, there was something in Nixon's personality that, led him down that road. Hastings quotes one of the Oval Office tapes as a kind of reference point for this behaviour, where Nixon declares to Kissinger, presumably in private, apropos of nothing, "I'm probably the toughest guy that's been in this office, probably since Theodore Roosevelt." And Kissinger, is like, "Oh, yeah, no question." And it's, it would be painful to listen to. And we know Kissinger in private had very different assessments of his boss. But in these rooms or on the phone with him, he's feeding that ego. Not unlike Lin Biao had done so with Mao. But the thing that's going on here is that Nixon, from a pretty sizable, view of most of the American public, he is kind of doing what they had asked for. He had reduced troop levels dramatically. He had brought hundreds of thousands of the troops home. He was extricating the US from this war. But polling revealed something interesting. These, focus groups, what's the equivalent? You get 15 people from a mall and you show them a new car and you say, "Hey, what do you think of this?" This kind of survey of people's opinions. The American people were asked, "Do you want ground troops in Vietnam?" The answer, no. It had been no for a while now. "Do you want the prisoners of war back?" Yes, a resounding yes. Now, how do you feel about bombing North Vietnam? Bombing was palatable. Ground troops? No. Bombing? Maybe. It was this distant technological thing. It didn't involve American boys slogging through swamps. A little bit perhaps like drone warfare is seen today. So Nixon has two crucial things in hand. China's not going to intervene, and the American public would tolerate bombing. The other thing that he's trying to keep afloat is the South Vietnamese regime for a tolerable amount of time, right? Sufficient distance from American withdrawal. So he has three things here. Vietnamization has stripped away the American crutch for the South Vietnamese state, however. Only US advisors and air power really remained. Nixon and Kissinger aren't naive. They do understand the fragility of Thieu's regime. Their diplomacy was aimed at delaying its collapse, but they kind of knew that maybe that wasn't going to happen forever. And this, of course, brings us to one of the most persuasive criticisms of the Nixon/Kissinger, for a lot of people, administration. They came to power promising the end of the war. Yet, by 1972, 3 years in, the conflict had expanded, most notably, as we saw, into Cambodia. The bombing had intensified. Tens of thousands more Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians were dead. Peace with honour had not meant peace. It had meant time, leverage, escalation, in order to negotiate from a position that looked strong enough politically at home in America. The charitable interpretation is that Nixon and Kissinger had inherited this poisoned baton. We've gone over this before. The war was handed down from Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson. None of them had wanted to lose Vietnam. None of them knew how to leave. Nixon didn't start the war. He's trying to end it. That is true, but the counter-argument is difficult to dismiss. If the eventual settlement, which we will discuss toward the end of the episode, which will be essentially ceasefire, northern troops stay in South Vietnam, and you delay the collapse of that state, well, if that's the end game, why didn't you just get there sooner? Why prolong the killing? Why expand the bombing? Why widen the war into Cambodia? Is the answer to this just politics? Was it just this partisan dance that has to be performed? An electoral timetable that has to be adhered to? A need to demonstrate toughness, avoid the appearance of surrendering, just to preserve a narrative? Is that worth tens of thousands of lives? unfortunately it's hard to really see it any other way. But we can condemn that while also knowing that it isn't unique. It wasn't unique just for the Americans, nor the other side of the Cold War. American politics had behaved this way before. It would behave this way again. But it's like I said before, this proxy war has its investors. And these investors are on both sides of the Cold War. They're looking to cash out from this. But the reasons that they got in the first place had very little to do with the flourishing of the Vietnamese people, north or south. And perhaps the same argument could apply to the communist Vietnamese themselves as well, in the ways they had relegated other countries in the region as a secondary tool to help their aim of national independence in the first place, and even in creating an Indo-Chinese federation, a communist bloc with Hanoi at the helm. That doesn't make it morally equivalent in every respect, of course not, but it does remind us of something uncomfortable. Politics isn't pretty, war is ugly, and none of the sides involved in this come out without blood on their hands, and all can be condemned to one degree or another. Take your pick. Much of these conversations, however, would come down the track. But at the end of March 1972, the largest offensive of the conflict begins. And as I said, this wasn't Tet 2, this wasn't a guerrilla infiltration, this was Soviet and Chinese supplied tanks rolling across the DMZ. The Geneva Accords discarded outright. Entire divisions surge into the south. The main thrust began across the DMZ into Quang Tri province in the north. Simultaneously, major attacks were launched in the central highlands toward Kon Tum and Tan Kham. And further south, forces moved toward An Loc, only 60 miles from Saigon. 3 fronts, a conventional invasion.
The North Vietnamese today continued to move men, guns, and tanks south across the demilitarized zone, continuing a 5-day enemy drive, which is the most serious action to take place in Vietnam in a long time. The main enemy thrust has been halted north of Quang Tri City, but other enemy units are trying to outflank the South Vietnamese defenders. American air support has been limited because of poor flying weather. The United States has moved and is moving a lot of firepower into the area. 3 carriers are offshore, and another carrier and a guided missile cruiser are on the way. The North Vietnamese claimed today to have shot down an American B-52 bomber. If that is true, it would be the first B-52 lost to the enemy in the war. American officials had no information on that, but here is what Robert Goralski learned at the Pentagon.
The options are limited. No longer can U.S. ground forces be used to shore up the South Vietnamese. As one official put it today, there just aren't that many more left to have any significant effect on the outcome. U.S. air power will be applied. An air armada of more than 500 attack planes is being readied. The prospect of massive retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnam is very real.
As shells fell in sustained barrages across the northern province of Quang Tri, eventually its central provincial capital was basically gone. It was the first time since the Tet Offensive that a major South Vietnamese city had fallen, and the psychological effect was enormous. At the same time, fighting erupted in the Central Highlands, that mountainous spine that runs down the middle of South Vietnam. Towns and fire bases guarding the approaches to the city of Kon Tum were hit by coordinated attacks. Further south again, communist divisions moved out of the Cambodian border areas and advanced toward the town of An Loc. The war was very close to the capital, in Saigon. In the north, some South Vietnamese units broke under the pressure. Tanks abandoned, officers losing control, civilians begin to flee south along Highway 1 in columns that mixed refugees with shattered military convoys. Hue, which had been, this site of so much suffering in 1968, seems to be exposed once again in this spring offensive. Up in the highlands, heavy guns pounded positions that had survived years of smaller-scale fighting. Soviet-made anti-tank missiles began knocking out South Vietnamese armour with unsettling ease. Entire defensive lines that had been built up over years gave way in days. There were serious discussions among South Vietnamese commanders about pulling back even further. What changed the trajectory of the offensive was not some sudden transformation inside the South Vietnamese army. They didn't just rally. It was what could come from the sky. Once the initial shock passed, once the northern units were committed in the open, with tanks on roads and artillery firing from fixed positions, they became vulnerable in a way they had not been in earlier years of the war. And the American response was overwhelming.
The U.S. command said this morning that a full week of sustained air raids against North Vietnam wrecked the country's air defense headquarters near Hanoi, where earlier intelligence reports had said Russian advisors and technicians worked. The main pipeline supplying oil to Hanoi's troops in the DMZ and South Vietnam was also knocked out during a series of 2,000 air strikes. According to the American command, the raids also cut more than 70 rail and road supply lines carrying equipment to North Vietnamese troops. In the ground war, North Vietnamese troops and tanks attacked Kon Tum for the second straight day. American B-52s dropped more than 700 tons of bombs around the city trying to disrupt the enemy attack. United Press International reported...
Around Kon Tum in the Central Highlands, B-52 strikes began to fall in carefully plotted patterns, day after day. Entire grid squares were flattened. Men described the ground physically lifting beneath them as the bombs landed. Over the course of just a few weeks, hundreds of heavy bomber strikes were directed at North Vietnamese concentrations. Tactical aircraft, F-4s, A-6s, gunships, they fly continuously, hunting armor and smashing artillery positions. Newly deployed anti-tank missiles mounted on aircraft began knocking out Soviet-supplied T-54 tanks, which had been unstoppable up to that point. At An Loc, the air effort reached an intensity rarely seen in the war. The town was encircled, thousands of shells rained down daily, yet overhead, American aircraft operated in waves. On some days, nearly 300 tactical airstrikes were flown in support of that single battlefield. B-52s dropped massive loads just outside the defensive perimeter, sometimes nearly around the clock. Almost 2,700 tons of ammunition and supplies were parachuted into the besieged city over the course of the siege. The North attacked repeatedly, and repeatedly their assault waves began to be broken up from the air. Then, in early May, Nixon expanded the air war beyond the battlefield in the South. On May 8th, he went on national television and announced the mining of Haiphong Harbour and a new bombing campaign against North Vietnam itself, Operation Linebacker. Over the following months, American aircraft flew tens of thousands of sorties. Rail yards, bridges, fuel depots, power stations, all were struck. Between April and October, more than 150,000 tons of ordnance fell on the north. Imports through Haiphong dropped to zero, oil storage was devastated, electrical generation capacity was shattered. It was the heaviest sustained air campaign of the war. By late May and June, the spring offensive had lost its momentum. The North still held Quang Tri in the north and large stretches of territory, but Kon Tum had not fallen, An Loc had not fallen, Saigon remained intact. The cost to the North had been immense. Tens of thousands of casualties, hundreds of tanks destroyed, artillery batteries shattered before even reaching the battlefield. Later, even Hanoi's own history would concede that the attacks had slowed and become progressively less effective. Militarily, the offense had failed to achieve its decisive objective. Among the young North Vietnamese soldiers fighting around Quang Tri in the spring of 1972 was a 17-year-old university student named Pham Thanh Hung, a boy who, by his own admission, believed he was meant to become a poet, not a soldier. Much of this comes from, again, Hastings' general history of the Vietnam War. Now, Hung, he had just finished his first year at Hanoi University when he and his classmates were informed that they weren't being drafted, they were volunteering. His father had tried to shield him from the war, but by 1972 the manpower strain was such that even students were being pulled in. There were half-hearted fantasies that he and his friend had the night before of drinking a bunch of coffee with nicotine, like with tobacco in it, in a hope that it would spike their heart rate and they would fail the medical exam, but it just didn't work, and within weeks, Hong was in uniform. And almost immediately, the war is feeling a lot different than the slogans. In Quang Tri province, several men in his unit were shot over successive nights, though no southern formation was nearby doing it. Eventually, the culprit was discovered, a 70-year-old woman acting as a lone sniper, avenging two sons who had fought for the South. She was executed once she was found. Hung felt unsettled by this. Yes, she was killing northern soldiers, but was she not, in her own way, fighting for her country? It was not a safe thought to entertain. Hong served on a 37mm anti-aircraft battery. At one point, his unit received a citation for shooting down 6 American aircraft. But later, he said flatly, it was all just propaganda. I don't remember us shooting down anything. Then the bombs started dropping on them. On April 21st, an airstrike hit the battery. A third of the gunners were killed, another third wounded. The guns themselves were smashed to bits. Survivors muttered angrily that the officers had to, poked a stick into the hornet's nest by firing and drawing attention to themselves. Morale faltered. Some men suddenly reported sick. One squad leader shot himself in the leg and begged Hong to confirm it had been enemy fire. He was arrested anyway. Hong noticed smaller things too that were unnerving. Packs were being stripped from the dead, equipment was taken from them because they didn't need it anymore. This was his army. He was transferred to a heavier artillery unit. Many of its men, former deserters, were offered this assignment instead of jail. That unit, too, was devastated by air attack. Hong was temporarily buried in his trench by concussions. When he clawed his way out, he was handed a bucket and told to collect scattered body parts. He later wrote that in that moment he realized something about himself. Quote, I was so terrified that I decided that not only was I unfit to be a hero, I did not think I could become a poet either. End quote. By the end of August, he was serving with the 308th Division under fire from the South Vietnamese around Quang Tri. And on his 18th birthday, the 26th of August, he decided to mark the occasion by catching fish from a nearby pond. The method was pretty crude, but apparently this is what people could do. During a lull in the, presumably, bombs being dropped, he leapt from his foxhole, emptied his AK-47 into the pond, and gathered the floating bodies of the fish. Then the bombs came. An American strike caught him in the open. The blast hurled him to the ground, and lying there, stunned, bleeding, he thought, quote, I am dying, and not honorably. Instead of being a hero, I am clutching a handful of dead fish, and I have never made love to a girl. End quote. He wasn't dead, but he was badly hit. The company medic had already been killed. A veterinary student patched his wounds. 2 soldiers tried to carry him to safety, dropped him during another strike, then returned. Let me crawl, he told them. It's less painful than being dropped again. A week later, he joined a column of walking wounded back up the trail. Quote, we looked a terrible sight, a defeated army, he remembered. We sang songs as we went, but they were very sad songs. At that time, we felt the war must go on forever, and that we could not possibly win. They passed fresh recruits heading south and muttered to one another, if those kids knew what they were heading for, they would turn around and run home. By the autumn of 1972, even a Northern Artillery Regiment commander admitted bluntly, "Our men just couldn't take it anymore." While young men like Hung were crawling out of bomb craters in Quang Tri, in Saigon, General Creighton Abrams, the US general in charge of the South Vietnamese war effort, was watching a different kind of collapse. The early weeks of the offensive had produced scenes he could barely conceal his anger about. Tanks abandoned along Highway 1, artillery left in place, units dissolving, equipment destroyed not by enemy fire but by panic. His fury was specific. To President Thieu and his chief of staff, he bluntly laid it out. Quote, "Equipment is not what you need. You need men who will fight. You need officers who will lead. You've got all the equipment you need. You lost most of your artillery because it was abandoned." End quote. Billions of dollars worth of American material had flowed into South Vietnam over the last decade. Modern tanks, armoured carriers, artillery, helicopters, radios. And yet, when the North Vietnamese armies had come across the demilitarized zone, when the pressure had come, much of this had just been left behind. Abrams had spent years defending Vietnamization, arguing that the South Vietnamese army definitely could stand on its own. Now he was watching its limits exposed in real time, and the strain was visible on him. By mid-1972, he was pushing back against further escalation in the north. He believed air power was needed in the southern battles, not diverted into grand strategic gestures. He opposed the widening of Linebacker, and his patience with the political choreography of the war was thinning. In Washington, in consequence, Henry Kissinger is less charitable about Abrams. In private, he dismissed him as being finished, too fat, drinking too much, no longer sharp enough for the job. He was replaced as head of MACV not long after. Of course, those who suffered most through this offensive were the civilians caught in it. At its height, as southern cities were attacked, the conditions were heartbreaking. The road south out of Quang Tri, Highway 1, was a caravan of suffering. When the city fell, the last 300 military patients from its hospital were loaded onto ambulances and trucks and sent down Route 1. The convoy never made it clear. It became trapped in a column of refugees and broken vehicles. Civilians on bikes, families on foot, soldiers mixing among them. And then the artillery began. Communist shells pounded the road. The ambulances were smashed into scrap metal. An airborne medic, Dr. Pham Viet Tu, later described what he saw when he moved through the wreckage. Hundreds of vehicles riddled with bullets and fragments, some burned to ash, human skeletons scattered across the roadbed. And one image he said he couldn't shake, the skeleton of a small child, perhaps 2 years old, lying inside a large aluminium wash basin. A tiny pair of rubber sandals beside what remained of its mother. Further south, in Hue, the communists did not immediately push on to seize the city, though it had been exposed. Instead, Hue filled with refugees and stragglers, and without enough police or military police to impose control over this chaotic situation, it descended into a much worse situation. Along the roadside, children stood and watched the human tide move past. One officer remembered a boy of about 12 holding a younger brother by the hand, a sheet of paper clutched in his fist. On it, it said, "We are children of Mr. Juan of Quang Tri. Can't find our parents. Please help us." Messages began appearing everywhere, on walls, on scraps of paper tied to tree trunks with rice paste. Short, desperate notes. To Private First Class Nguyen Van Ba, 157th Battalion. The children and I are moving to Auntie's home in Da Nang. Another. Corporal Bay, 3rd 2nd Infantry, to wife. I'm alive and fighting. Buddha blesses you and our kids. Another read. Wife Wa, to husband Sergeant Truong, RF Quang Tri. VC Mortar killed our baby girl yesterday. The boy is safe with me. Don't worry and don't go AWOL. In Hue, a woman named Ms. Bong, who had survived the terror of the 1968 offensive, wrote to a friend that her only surviving son had left home. She was alone now with her daughter and a small grandchild. "If my dear son is killed, I don't know what I should do," she wrote. "We think now this terrible war will never end. My poor children." In September, South Vietnamese Marines fought their way back into the shattered citadel of Quang Tri. The price was severe, roughly 5,000 casualties to retake a city that had basically been reduced to rubble. But not everything was taken back. The fire bases along Route 9 were not recovered, and the strip of territory south of the DMZ remained under communist control. Dong Ha, once a major American base, became, over the next 3 years, a functioning supply port through which materiel moved up the Qua Viet River into northern hands. By the end of 1972, roughly half of South Vietnam's 4 northern provinces remained under communist domination, along with the western borderlands adjoining Laos and Cambodia. The territorial balance that emerged here basically lasted until 1975, when the war would finally end. And even over the course of the Spring Offensive, the American presence continued to disappear. In the first 6 months of 1972, more than 135,000 US troops departed. They left fewer than 50,000 by mid-year, and a South Vietnamese officer later described driving through former American installations at Phu Bai, Dong Tam, and Quy Nhon and seeing, abandoned barracks, shuttered bars and brothels, and crumbling shantytowns that had once thrived on American money. The physical infrastructure of the war was dismantled, even as some of the largest battles of the conflict were still unfolding. The reduction in US ground forces did not bring a proportional reduction in violence, however. In the Mekong Delta, where North Vietnamese regular units had previously been rare, thousands now appeared. An American advisor in My To remarked, "We've got North Vietnamese soldiers up to our ears." Another, observing communist troops absorb B-52 strikes and continue operating, reflected that this was a different ballgame from what we've been used to up in these parts. To sustain the war effort, the guerrilla war effort in this instance, in these northern provinces, Saigon redeployed troops from rural districts, abandoning those local posts and therefore thinning its presence in the countryside. And therefore, that allowed, in several areas, communist cadre of either the North or the Viet Cong to move in with comparatively restrained administration and consolidate their influence while resuming targeted assassinations for those associated with the Saigon regime. The process was gradual, but this just alters the presence on the ground and eats away at what the state of South Vietnam can call itself. At the end of the offensive, in strictly military terms, the South had held. Kon Tum and Loc did not fall. The communists had suffered extremely heavy losses, perhaps over 100,000 casualties by some estimates, and they'd lost a lot of that armor and artillery. Chinese officials criticized Hanoi for pressing too far. South Vietnamese forces also paid heavily. Around 11,000 killed, perhaps 50,000 casualties overall. Civilian losses approached 25,000. And most of the roughly 300 Americans killed over that year had died during this spring campaign. But there were moments of pride in Saigon. Officers gathered in private homes, drinking liquor, recounting the destruction of North Vietnamese tanks. And for some, it did feel like a genuine stand had been made. Maybe they could stand on their own 2 feet. Abrams, while he was still in charge, emphasized that point, arguing that despite serious failures, enough units had fought effectively to demonstrate that the South Vietnamese army could endure. Perhaps Vietnamization would endure. Others were less convinced. A CIA report from Saigon concluded that without American air support, the country would have collapsed. In Washington, members of Congress were already pressing to curtail funding for those very same air operations in the future. And the view from Hanoi? Well, despite the scale of their losses, just like the Tet Offensive, the Politburo judged the campaign worthwhile. The offensive had forced the United States into intensified negotiations and underscored South Vietnam's dependence on American air power, which wouldn't last forever. If this was the final battle of the American Vietnam War, then it proved that without the Americans, the South would fall.
I'll make that point, of course. Yes, we've withdrawn 400,000, and our casualties are down, and we've made a peace offer. And
couldn't we say that the first thing that one has to remember is that the other side is using, with some indignation against the other side, that they are using them brutally, using the prisoners brutally.
I know. No, I will say that, but then, of course, Henry, the question is, now, what are you going to do about it?
But secondly, we have made every reasonable offer that can be made.
Now they say, well, all those offers haven't been, they don't stop there. All those offers have been turned down, and they don't expect them. What are you going to do?
Well, but then, what I have always said to the wives is, I don't know whether one can say that to a national audience. I have always said to the wives that I don't believe your husbands want you to have America just surrender. That we've gone 9/10 of the way towards the other side.
It'll work with them because they're still basically patriots. It will not work now with the national audience. Putting it in terms. It's been very, very heavily polled in the last couple of months. That is, you see, that's the thing, the new factor we've got here as to what we can wheel, and they're quite aware of this. It's just the attrition of the support for the war. That's the basic thing. Problem, which
I think the problem is also what the Australian Prime Minister said to me. That I didn't say Prime Minister, the ambassador, he said as he goes around the country, he's the only guy that's speaking for the war.
I know.
And no one ever speaks up for it, and the people get confused.
True, but don't get any. We can't be under illusions that you can do this before certain intelligent audiences and the rest. But
of course, Mr. President, I believe if you watch, if I have to give my honest conviction, if you watch the history of the war, the opponents have always focused on one thing. I don't happen to believe, but you may have polled it, that the use of air power upsets the American people.
It does, but not the use of air power. It has nothing to do with that. It's just the fact that it's the war. You see, because the media puts it in terms of the continuation of the war. No, I don't think you could say that you could just continue air power for 4 or 5 years.
No, you can't say.
It's not going to work. It won't wheel. That means that then you have failed in an effort to bring the war to an end, and you've left them.
I just don't have the benefit of these polls. I don't have the sense that Vietnam is that much of an issue in people's minds.
As you can tell, my dear listener, from that conversation that Kissinger and Nixon were having on the 1st of January 1972, much of the rest of the year was already within their planning. The problem of how to politically handle the wives of the prisoners of war, exactly how the American people might perceive the bombing if it continued, but that it could not continue indefinitely, regardless of all of these specific levers of violence that were being alternatively pulled, we have been able to lay bare the brass tacks of what all of this really came down to through some of these conversations. Like I said before, I don't think we should think that Nixon and Kissinger are these complete aberrations here, but the way that the Nixon White House was run, how much power Kissinger had, and how much they wished to execute their plans without the meddling of those pesky politicians or even the wider functions of government, was pretty unique for the time. as was the amount of recordings being made of all of these conversations, which we are now privy to. By October, with Beijing, Moscow, and the Spring Offensive behind them, well, their conversations shift to the reality of the negotiations for getting out of Indochina and what is going to happen next. And if you thought that the secret Paris peace negotiations between Kissinger and Lê Duc Tho were open and frank, well, the discussions between Nixon and Kissinger are a different level.
We face a situation here where South Vietnam, simply over the long haul, cannot survive on its own as an independent entity. I don't mean like Thailand with a guarantee. I don't mean like anything else. But the South Vietnam, because of the nature of the South Vietnamese people, the nature of the struggle with the North and so forth, that inevitably, unless the United States can stay in there indefinitely, South Vietnam is going to fall.
What we will try for is to get international control on all the infiltration routes. A ceasefire in Laos. In Cambodia it's hard to arrange, but because there are no formal parties, a commitment by the North Vietnamese to withdraw from Laos and Cambodia. Military are a bunch of selfish bastards.
They screwed up everything we've done, except they did the mining.
Apologies there for the audio, my dear listener. I have tried to clean that up a bit, but it does still sound like it was recorded from inside of a briefcase. There are some metallic squinks and low rumples throughout, but I hope you were able to hear those parts I'd isolated. Those are the cold, hard truths. That is the real price that was willing to be negotiated. South Vietnam might fall, but as long as the Nixon administration had enough time to find a place sufficiently clear of the blast zone, well, so it goes. We also get these hints into the psyche of the office. The world is against me kind of vibes. The Congress, the military, they keep screwing up things for us. It's this exasperation at the pushback against what, to them, is so clearly the way forward. Finishing this war on America's terms. This has been spelled out by the dynamic duo 2 months earlier, in August of 1972, and I don't have a tape of this one, but the transcript is provided in Ed Miller's primary source collection. I'll quote it directly. Nixon. We also have to realize, Henry, that winning an election is important. It's terribly important this year. But can we have a viable foreign policy if a year from now or 2 years from now North Vietnam gobbles up South Vietnam? That's the real question, Kissinger. If a year or 2 years from now North Vietnam gobbles up South Vietnam, we can have a viable foreign policy if it looks as if it's the result of South Vietnamese incompetence. If we now sell out in such a way that, say, within a 3 to 4 month period, we have pushed President Thieu over the brink, I think there is going to be, even the Chinese won't like that. I mean, they'll pay verbally they'll like it, Nixon, but it will worry them, Kissinger, it will worry everybody. And domestically, in the long run, it won't help us at all that much, because our opponents will say, we should have done it 3 years ago, Nixon. I know, Kissinger. So we've got to find some formula that holds the thing together a year or two, after which, after a year, Mr. President, Vietnam will be a backwater. If we settle it, say, this October, by January 1974, no one will give a damn. How much this assessment and recommendation that Kissinger gives Nixon, how much this becomes reality is shocking. And when it's laid out like this in these callous ways, well, it's hard to think that for our story, for the Cambodian story, that if Kissinger is going to talk about Vietnam, this quagmire that had had millions and millions spent on it, had been a central problem for the last 3 administrations. Tens of thousands of US troops had died there. If he thinks that Vietnam will, blow over in a couple of years, that Vietnam will be a backwater, then it's easy to imagine just how low Cambodia was in comparison, in his estimations. Now, in that tape, we did hear a mention about Laos and Cambodia. Remember, this was from October, and the Paris Peace Accords are basically being settled at that moment. Now, he mentions that there's no one to negotiate with in terms of the Cambodian Communist Front in the war, but they hoped to secure the North Vietnamese army leaving the country. Obviously, we'll explore Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge's role in the, so-called end of the Vietnam War in the next episode. But what I wanted to highlight here was another tape to give us a little bit of light on Cambodia, as well as some ideas of how the Nixon administration really ran and how that will actually cascade into much bigger problems. So, just days before Nixon had gone on television to announce the bombing campaign against North Vietnam in response to the Spring Offensive, he was speaking to Kissinger and another aide, John Connolly, discussing how they had handled the other bombing campaign 3 years earlier, the secret bombing of the Cambodian border regions. And we get, from the horse's mouth, the letting in on the methods of this White House, the secrecy, the willingness to go outside norms, outside procedures, even outside legality to pursue their aims. Not to mention some of the paranoia that's going along with this and informing some of these decisions.
And we carried out a series of strikes called the menu strikes. Nobody knows.
Again, terribly sorry, but I could not sufficiently get this to a listenable quality, so I will perform this role for you as you heard Nixon begin. John, as I should say this, before we did Cambodia, this is not known to anybody, I had ordered, and we'd carried out, a series of strikes called the menu strikes. Nobody knows it on Cambodia, on the sanctuaries with B-52s. They were called the menu strikes, well, because, and Kissinger attempts to interject here, they were called the breakfast strikes. And then I said, all right, that's what I don't imagine the bastards out there called them. I said, Henry, the hell with that. A menu just isn't breakfast. Let's have lunch and dinner too. So we took breakfast, lunch, and then we bombed the hell out of those sanctuaries. Nobody ever knew it, and they didn't say a goddamn word. And then Kissinger actually intimates that this bombing had seriously pushed the Vietnamese troops further into Cambodia. Both of them agree that this was a key moment in what happened in Cambodia next. And then later in the discussion, when they're talking about the members of Nixon's own sort of administration that were involved with this, and they're speaking about people who lied about this or tried to say that they didn't know about it, and Nixon turns to Kissinger and he says, well, we have that on record. And also, I hope you taped that goddamn call that you made. You made a record of all those things, and the tape sort of goes in and out, and Kissinger agrees.
You made a record of all these things. Yeah, so the next morning that the president called in.
The last time we spoke about Operation Menu was in Season 2, and here we have Nixon and Kissinger discussing it in frank detail. Again, this is one of the bizarre aspects of the Nixon White House, that we're, able to listen to these kinds of conversations at all, which, were not supposed to have been listened to. But given this fly-on-the-wall position, we hear exactly how they operated. In secret, authority deemed to be sufficient if it came from the top. No need to tell anyone outside of a need-to-know basis kind of thing, even when it came to bombing at the time, neutral country. The bombing campaign had been carried out without public acknowledgement. Strike coordinates were routed through alternative reporting channels so that official logs would not openly reflect that the planes had been flying onto the Cambodian front. Knowledge of the operation was compartmentalized. Even senior officials were not fully briefed in advance. But when fragments of this operation did become leaked, and only a small amount had happened by this time, it will get worse in the next year, but it was just more fuel to the fire of Nixon's paranoia, threats to his executive authority that he and Kissinger had cultivated. This climate had intensified in 1971, when Daniel Ellsberg released what came to be known as the Pentagon Papers, a classified Department of Defense study commissioned under Robert McNamara that traced the internal history of American involvement in Vietnam. This study revealed years of private doubt and public misrepresentation across multiple administrations. For Nixon, who had, not been responsible for the decisions in the report, the leak was still, to him, deeply destabilizing. And it's weird because Nixon actually could have treated these leaks as the perfect source to prove, he could have gotten out of Vietnam in whatever way he wanted to. He need only point to all of the Democrat choices which had gotten America into this mess. And he could have been, the white knight to get them out of it. Because these documents admit that as early as the mid-60s, there was a commitment to this war that everyone was saying had very little benefit. But instead, he took this leak, the Pentagon Papers, as another example that things could get out, and he needed to do something about this. He needed to clamp down. The response wasn't just legal injunctions on newspapers and things like that, but investigations were launched within the administration. Wiretaps were authorized on officials and journalists suspected of leaking information. A small unit was eventually created inside the White House, formally titled the Special Investigations Unit, informally known as the Plumbers, whose purpose was to prevent further leaks, further disclosures. It was this special unit that would later break into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist in an effort to find material that would discredit him. Now, from that pattern of covert domestic action undertaken in the name of protecting national security and preserving executive control with, encouragement from Nixon, the Watergate operation would emerge. And that is the gate that gave us Gate. So by June 1972, when 5 men were arrested inside the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex, the incident was publicly framed as a failed burglary tied to Nixon's re-election campaign. But the deeper layers of campaign espionage, covert funding, and obstruction were not yet fully visible at that point. For many Americans, it registered as an odd but secondary story in a year dominated by the war, by summitry in Beijing and Moscow, and by the dramatic battles of the Spring Offensive. It's going slightly too far to suggest that there's this straight line from the menu bombings to the same kind of behavior that eventually characterized Watergate, but secret tapes and Nixon's eventual downfall, all of these are a pretty rich tapestry. There is not like there's no connection at all. However, all of this would not come to light until the next year, 1973. And what had been this primary accelerant behind much of what we've discussed was still on the horizon for Nixon. As the election approached in November, the broader public narrative seemed coherent and even triumphant. Nixon had opened relations with China. He had signed agreements with the Soviet Union. American troop levels in Vietnam had fallen dramatically. Negotiations in Paris were moving right toward conclusion. The president, who had promised to wind down the war and restore American hegemony abroad, appeared, at least in the moment, to have delivered. And his win in November was going to be a landslide.
We know what you're looking for.
The people of JCPenney bring you election night. Over 150,000 JCPenney associates in 1,700 stores across the country are waiting to help you find what you're looking for.
We're going to take a look at the electoral vote projection that we have made so far this evening based on the 4 states we have so far awarded to President Nixon on the basis of our computations. You will see there that those 4 states, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana, give President Nixon 57 electoral votes so far. McGovern, so far, none. 270 needed to win. These are based on...
And my fellow citizens of this great and good country we share together. When we met here 4 years ago, America was bleak in spirit depressed by the prospect of seemingly endless war abroad and of destructive conflict at home. As we meet here today, we stand on the threshold of a new era of peace in the world.
Nixon had ridden to victory on peace, world peace in his words, at his inauguration. But for Vietnam and Cambodia, this wasn't going to be the reality. Perhaps it would be peace for Americans, but not them. In the week following the inauguration, on the 27th of January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. It was Kissinger who had, much to Nixon's annoyance, gotten much of the adulation. He appeared to be the architect of a diplomatic breakthrough that finally had gotten the United States out of the quagmire, like it was his genius, his acumen that had been essential to drafting the Paris Peace Accords. He had made it happen. In October, he had publicly announced that peace was at hand, in time for Nixon to have reaped all the benefits for that in the lead up to the election. Now, Hastings has an interesting take on this when he says that when the agreement was actually seen, what the actual peace accords were, what the contract looked like, well, it wasn't exactly the masterful piece of genius that Kissinger had allowed an impression of. The terms would see the Americans withdraw their remaining forces, as they already had been. They did secure their prisoners of war to be released from North Vietnam, and a ceasefire would freeze the battlefield in place, but with much of the communist gains still in place following the offensive. And crucially, the North Vietnamese troops that were already in South Vietnam, they can stay there. In effect, Washington had accepted the central reality that Hanoi had insisted upon for years. The Americans were going to go, and the balance of power within the South would be settled later, by them. Many of the additional provisions contained in the final accords, political arrangements, supervisory mechanisms, guarantees of neutrality, all of that rested on assumptions that neither side fully expected to, carry out. The most visible concession from North Vietnam, the one that allowed the White House to present this settlement as something more than just capitulation, was the abandonment of its prior demand that President Nguyen Van Thieu be removed as leader of South Vietnam before any agreement could be signed. This allowed the Americans to save face and to not have had to resort to, a coup against the South Vietnamese leader. But with the North getting the other concessions, the prospect of just eventually toppling the South Vietnamese leader themselves didn't seem too difficult. Another calculation by the communists had also led them to agree to this deal. They had predicted that Nixon would win the election in November. So when that became a more concrete reality, well, they knew that they couldn't hold out that perhaps a Democrat administration would be easier to negotiate with. And with Nixon getting another 4 years, well, they couldn't 100% know exactly if he would come back to the negotiation table in a much more bullish manner. Once the Americans were gone, the struggle could continue on terms far more favourable to the revolutionary side. The removal of the imperialists was the decisive step when it comes down to it, right? The dismantling of their southern clients they calculated was going to come in due course. And this reading of the situation was not confined to Hanoi. Within the government of South Vietnam, there was a grim recognition that this agreement had left northern forces in place and committed the US to departure, altering the strategic balance in ways that they could not reverse. The South Vietnamese regime saw the writing on the wall. And beyond Vietnam's borders, there was no equivalent agreement at all. In Cambodia, there was no signed settlement, no internationally recognized ceasefire, no timetable for disengagement. As the American war in Vietnam moved towards formal conclusion, the conflict next door remained fluid, violent, and unresolved. A theatre where the Khmer Rouge were gaining strength, the Lon Nol regime was collapsing under its own incompetence, and where American air power would continue to be applied without the constraints now imposed by Paris in Vietnam. Cambodia would stop being the sideshow and become the only game in town.